Hey, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the characteristic curve and getting into breaking down the different portions of the curve so that you have a little bit better understanding of how to manipulate these things in camera so that you are essentially building your own palette in effect so that you can build on that to develop a visual style. Now, I don't want to get too much into the technology of all this, but once you've got a basic understanding of this and you see how it applies in the next chapter, which will be on POV, and then in the third chapter, which will be combining the two together, it will suddenly all come together and you'll realize that you can take this information, go out and elevate your cinematography and become a creator of images rather than an imitator. So let's get to it. Okay, so here we go. Let's get stuck into this characteristic curve and see what it's all about. You're probably looking at it going, oh my God, what the hell is he talking about? He's getting into all this technical stuff. Yeah, sure, it's a little bit technical, but I've made this as easy and as straightforward as possible. And believe me, if you can understand this and get this as an intuitive part of the way you work, your cinematography is going to improve enormously from where it is now. And if you think it can't improve any further, wait till you start using this, because this is going to catapult it into a whole new realm. So first off, let's look at the characteristic curve. The curve you see here is basically, we'll call that a normal curve. And let's say that's for a camera with an 800 ASA ISO setting and with about 12 to 15 stops of dynamic range. So we see there's the flat part at the bottom, there's the straight line portion, the flat part at the top. Where those two breaks occur, at the top is the knee point and at the bottom is the black point. And we can see that down the bottom are all the blacks and up the top are all the highlights. So as we go up the curve, we're going from black down at the bottom up to white at the top. Now let's drop in another curve, and this one you can see is a little bit steeper than the previous one. So what that represents is a high contrast curve. So it's got a higher gamma, and the gamma is actually the gradient of the curve. It's the distance along the horizontal versus the distance up the vertical, and that's what gives you the gradient of the curve. So a normal curve somewhere around 0.45. The steep curve is about 0.75 and thereabouts, depending on the camera. And now let's drop in another curve, and this one, the flatter one, you can see is a little bit flatter at the bottom, a little bit flatter at top, and a little bit flatter overall in the central part. So that's got a lower gamma, and the gamma on this might be 0.35. Again, this is just a generalization, so I'm just giving you rough parameters. So let's look at it another way. In the old system, the purple curve, the flatter curve, would represent, let's say, film rec, whereas the steeper curve would represent video rec. What that means is that the steeper curve is going to be a little bit higher contrast, less detail in the blacks, less detail in the highlights, less fall off between the blacks and at the bottom end into the blacks, and less detail in the fall off into the highlights at the top end. So on the other one, which would be film rec, we've got a little bit flatter bottom part of the curve and a little bit flatter top part. So there's a lot more roll off into the blacks at the bottom and into the whites at the top. So a lot more detail at those ends of the curve. Let's go back and look at it in terms of film stocks. The flatter curve represents, let's say, a negative, whereas the steeper curve represents a positive. So the flatter negative has a lot more detail in the shadows, a lot more detail in the highlights, and a lot more tonal variation through the middle part of the curve, or through the gamma part of the curve. And then when we print it onto a higher contrast stock, so it snaps everything up. Now let's bring it into the digital realm. And we bring it into the digital realm, and then all of a sudden we've got, let's say we're shooting in log or in raw, would be the bottom curve, and Rec 709 would be the steeper curve. So when we're recording, we want the flattest possible curve with the highest possible latitude, the most detail we can get in the blacks and the most detail we can get in the highlights. So we've got the flattest curve possible. And then when we go into color grade and we start dropping LUTs on, or drop it into Rec 709, or however we're going to treat it in post-production, then all of a sudden we're bringing it back into the realm of the steeper curve, which snaps all the contrast back into it. Now, in those two junction points, where the gamma goes into the blacks and the gamma goes into the highlights, we've got 2 points that are infinitely adjustable. Now you can adjust them in the camera when you're on location or in prep, and that point can be adjusted up and down the curve, and will give you a different break point where you go into the blacks and a different break point where you go into the whites. And you can see that very clearly. So when you're doing your prep and you're determining your visual style, you may decide that you want to roll off into the highlights a little bit earlier, so you'll adjust that white point down. Or you may decide that you want to go into roll off into the blacks a little bit earlier to get a little bit more shadow detail. Then you'll bring that black point up. But all of that's adjustable up and down. Now, furthermore, you can go into the adjustments if you look at the curve on the bottom, and the curve can actually be tilted up and down as well. So not only can you move the point that it breaks into black and white up and down the gamma curve, but you can move the bottom part of the curve, which is essentially the black gamma and the white gamma, move them up and down so you can get more or less detail in the whites as well. So you could change your gamma curve into anything you want. So what does all this mean? Well, what it all means is that whereas once upon a time we used to have to be dictated to by the film manufacturers as to what film stocks we could actually use, now we've got cameras where we can manipulate the camera to give us whatever we want before we even get to post-production, so that we've got the ability to essentially manufacture our own film stocks or build our own palettes for every show that we do. So depending on the visual style, we can now go in and we can move all those parameters around inside the camera and build whatever palette we want to start putting our visual style onto. And in the next video, I'm going to break down those black and white points so that we can get into it in a little bit more detail. But again, as I said at the beginning of this, don't let all this get the better of you, because you should look at this and just take it all in as a general picture of how your camera works and how you can manipulate your camera. And all of this will come together when we get into chapter 2 and chapter 3, and we start looking at how you apply all this into real world situations.